Welcome back, dear listener. Or if this is your first time by the fire, welcome. You found your way to the quiet hour of the nighttime historian, a place where the winds of time still stir the dust of forgotten roads, where the echo of sandals and ceremony still lingers in the stone, and the past arrives not with thunder, but with breath and shadow and silence. Before we begin tonight's tale, I invite you, if you'd like, to leave a comment and share where you're listening from. Whether it's a quiet room in the city, a cabin tucked beneath snow-dusted pines, or a balcony overlooking a sleeping village where lanterns flicker in the dusk, it's always a quiet joy to know where these stories are being heard, and by whom. And if you find yourself returning to this fireside, night after night, perhaps consider subscribing, but only if these stories truly speak to you. Tonight we journey into the heart of ancient Persia, to a moment just after the golden reign of Cyrus the Great has passed into memory. The empire he built stands vast, but restless. Rebellions flicker at its edges like sparks at the hem of a king's robe. And from these fires rises a new figure. His name was Dariush, or Dariush, who would be the second of the Achaemenid kings to be called the Great. He was not born a king, not even in the line of kings. He was a soldier, a distant cousin, a whisper in the court's shadows. And yet, through war, vision, and perhaps something more divine, he would not only claim the throne, he would redefine what it meant to wear it. Organizer of empire, builder of Persepolis, speaker of laws in many tongues, Dariush carved roads across the world and unity from chaos. Tonight, we'll follow his journey from rebellion to reign, from the high cliffs of Behistun to the wide waters of the Nile, from the dusty roads of the royal courier to the silence before Marathon's charge. We'll meet a queen whose blood was prophecy, witness the forging of an imperial machine, and walk the shadowed corridors of ambition, faith, and memory. So now, let your shoulders drop. Let the hum of modern life fade into soft darkness. Imagine the scent of distant incense, the cool hush of ancient palaces, and the desert wind whispering through cedar-beamed halls. And now, let the firelight dance a little lower. Let us return to the lands of empire, to a throne hard won, and to the footsteps of a man who would rule not merely with might, but with order, vision, and stone. This is the story of Darius the Great. The desert wind moves quietly tonight, curling over the ochre hills of ancient Anshan, rustling the scrub grass, brushing gently against the stones of a ruined citadel where, long ago, the world shifted. Some say he was sent away as a child, hidden by a fearful grandfather, raised among shepherds. Others say he walked the courts early, watching, listening, learning the rhythm of royal life, like a slow and deliberate melody. What we know is this: when the time came, Cyrus rose, and when he rose, the world changed shape. With quiet cunning and sudden force, Cyrus broke the chains of the Median yoke and claimed their crown. But he did not stop. He moved outward, toward Lydia, Babylon, and the deep rivers of the east. And wherever he went, cities fell not only to the sword, but to something rarer, to respect. His enemies found themselves conquered, and yet not humiliated. He bowed before their gods, restored their temples, freed their captives. He did not burn their cities. He added them to his vision, a vision unlike anything the world had seen before. Not a kingdom, Not even an empire in the old sense, but something more. An order, vast and purposeful, ruled not by fear alone, but by a kind of sacred law. He was a conqueror, yes, but also a philosopher, a lawgiver in bronze and brick. They called him King of the Four Corners of the world. And long after his death, the memory of Cyrus the Great would linger like perfume in royal courts, sweet, elusive, golden. To understand what came next, we must understand what Cyrus imagined. The empire he built stretched farther than any before it, from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. But it was not only its size that defined it, it was its soul. Cyrus governed many peoples, many gods, many tongues, and yet he did not force them into one. He allowed their prayers to rise in the languages of their ancestors. He walked with priests and scribes of many traditions. In Babylon, he honored Marduk. In Judea, he freed the exiles. In Lydia, he spared their customs. His rule was a patchwork, but it held. He saw himself not as a destroyer, but as a restorer, one who brought harmony from disarray. His was a kingdom of light and order. Asha, the Zoroastrian word for truth and rightness, may have echoed in his counsels, though we cannot say for certain. But his actions suggest it, a yearning for cosmic balance, for empire as a living structure in which each part, no matter how small, held meaning. And so, the name of Cyrus passed into legend. The bricks of Babylon still whisper it. The tablets of Persepolis will recall him. And yet, no empire, no matter how wide or wise, escapes the tremble of time. And when the great king fell, some say in battle, others say in the eastern wilderness, the question of what comes next began to ripple outward, and the throne of the empire began slowly to shake. In the quiet after Cyrus's passing, a stillness settled over the empire. Not peace, but pause. Governors waited, armies held their breath. In the throne room of Pasargadae, the peacock throne stood untouched, the gold catching sunlight, but casting no shadow. And yet, not all was still. In the high courts and inner chambers, the lines of power began to shift, subtly, silently, like sand beneath a tent post. And at the center of it all was a woman whose blood carried the weight of kings. The air is cool within the palace walls, sweet with the scent of cypress oil and myrrh. Behind gauze-curtained archways, the rustle of silk and soft sandals moves like whispers in the dark. There, in a chamber adorned with gold and lapis, not too far from where kings once stood and empires were charted, sits a woman upon a carved wooden throne, her hands folded like still water, her gaze calm, unreadable and ancient. This is Atossa. Born to Cyrus the Great, Atossa was not merely the daughter of a king, she was the living breath of his legacy. Her lineage bound her to the empire's beginning. Her presence carried the myth of its founding through the shadowed corridors of power. She had watched her father conquer not just lands, but hearts, restoring temples, freeing peoples, and forging an empire in the name of order and respect. And she had watched him fall. A legend turned memory, leaving behind a throne too large for any one man to inherit. She became queen to Cambyses, her own brother, a union meant to preserve the divine purity of royal blood. In that union, Atossa held not only the memory of Cyrus, she held the future, should one ever come to claim it. But Cambyses would not reign long. His death, shrouded in confusion, perhaps madness, perhaps design, opened the empire's ribs to fracture. In his place came Bardia, or one claiming to be. Some whispered he was the true son of Cyrus, returned to right his brother's wrongs. Others claimed he was an impostor, a Magian priest cloaked in deception. No one knew for certain, or if they did, they stayed silent. It was in this silence that Atossa endured. While generals hesitated and satraps watched one another with wary eyes, she remained, the still center of the storm. And then, out of the court's margins, stepped a man named Dariush, not of the direct royal line, not a son of Cyrus, but a noble of good name and great ambition. It is said Atossa saw in him not just a husband, but a path. By joining her lineage to his sword, she did what no one else could. She made his claim real. Their marriage was not merely alliance. It was strategy. It was prophecy. It was rebirth. With Atossa at his side, Dariush could point to the blood of Cyrus and say, "It flows now in me, and through me it shall endure." She would bear him sons, including Xerxes, the future king, the future conqueror, and in doing so, she became more than queen. She became continuity, the bridge between the empire's glorious origin and its uncertain tomorrow. No edicts survive in her name, no statues boast her likeness, but every step of the Achaemenid line moved through her. She was the breath between two dynasties, the hand that steadied the throne as it tilted. And though time has left few words from her own hand, the empire moved with her. For when she walked through the marbled halls of Persepolis, even the walls, they say, seemed to bow ever so slightly, and somewhere behind those walls, a soldier's shadow was beginning to stretch toward the throne. It is the year 522 BCE. The air in the heartlands of Persia feels thinner than it once did, as if the empire itself is holding its breath. The throne is technically occupied. A man called Bardia rules in the name of Cyrus's blood, but something is amiss. His orders come with hesitation. His face is rarely seen. His presence, even in court, seems ghost-like. And across the empire, from Bactria to Babylon, the whisper spreads. Is this truly Bardia, the son of Cyrus, or a Magian impostor cloaked in illusion? Into this uncertainty steps a man named Dariush, 30-something, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of command but not the lineage of kings. He is the son of Hystaspes, a noble from the house of Achaemenid, distant cousin to Cyrus, loyal commander of the royal bodyguard, a man known for discipline and intelligence. Until now, his name has been carved only in silence, but in the weeks to come, it will be carved into cliffs and memory. According to Dariush, as he himself will later inscribe in the stone cliffs of Behistun, it was all a lie. Bardia had been murdered secretly by Cambyses months before his own death. The man now ruling was no royal son, but a Magian priest named Gaumata. He had taken the throne by deception, hidden behind the likeness of a dead prince, and only Dariush had the will and the divine right to set things right. This is his version. This is his myth, and like all myths, it has been carved not just in stone, but in power. He gathered 6 noblemen, companions of ambition, or perhaps of truth. Together they plotted to kill the false king. They crept into the royal stronghold near the Persian town of Sikayovati. Swords were drawn, blood was spilled, and the impostor lay dead. Or so the inscription says. In that moment the empire was without a ruler. and the men who stood with Dariush turned to each other and asked, "Who now shall sit upon the peacock throne?" Some say they debated it. Others say Dariush claimed it outright. The Behistun inscription would have you believe it was destiny, that the god Ahura Mazda chose him, and that his victories in battle were simply divine order reasserting itself. But whispers in the court spoke differently. Some said he had no right, that he was a usurper who killed a legitimate king and spun the tale backwards, that he had seized the empire not by justice, but by sword and marriage. After all, within weeks of Gaumata's death, he married not one, but several daughters of Cyrus, including Atossa. And yet, despite the doubts, Dariush moved quickly, decisively. He declared himself king of kings, not just ruler but restorer. The empire, he said, had been twisted by lies. He would set it straight. The provinces, some shocked, others emboldened, began to rise in revolt. Elam rebelled, Media burned, Babylon crowned its own kings. In Dariush's first year on the throne, the empire cracked in 19 places, and so he took to the field, again and again, crushing resistance with swift force. His inscriptions say it plainly. I fought 9 kings in 1 year, and I defeated them all. But still the question lingered, beneath the marble halls and between the lines of stone. Was Dariush the savior of the empire, or its thief? And perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the tension between the sword and the scroll. He was a soldier, yes, but he became far more. Through battle, diplomacy, architecture, law, and vision, he would not only hold the empire, he would remake it. And in doing so, Dariush began to write a new chapter, not just for himself, but for every subject of his realm. In the years to come, the world would see roads carved from dust, cities lifted from clay, and a sense of order where once there had only been flame. But first, the rebellions had to be extinguished, the walls had to hold, and a king, real or claimed, had to prove that he could not only take a throne, but keep it. The fires of rebellion had been put out, one by one, in Babylon, in Elam, in Parthia, in Media, in the very heart of Persia. The empire, once fractured into 19 wounds, now lay bandaged beneath the firm and deliberate hand of a king who had survived his trial by fire. And yet, Dariush knew what many kings never did, that an empire cannot be ruled by force alone. The sword wins the day, but it is the ink, the road, the weight of law and trust that wins the decades. The year is 519 BCE. The air over the Zagros mountain smells of clay dust and cedar smoke. From the steppes of Central Asia to the sun-bleached stones of Sardis, the empire breathes again, uneasy, but breathing. For the first time since the death of Cyrus, messengers travel safely. The markets of Susa awaken. Priests begin to chant again in temples that only months before had echoed with fear. Dariush, seated on a modest throne in a fortress still marked by war, begins his second conquest, not of lands, but of order. It began with structure. The empire had grown enormous, too large for a single city or council to manage. Dariush divided it into 20 provinces, satrapies he called them, each with its own governor, its own tax quota, its own garrison. These satraps were powerful, yes, but never beyond his reach. He placed royal inspectors above them, the so-called eyes and ears of the king, who travelled in secrecy, listened in silence, and reported back to the capital. Corruption was punished. Justice was swift. The king would know what happened in every corner of his realm, or so he believed. And then came the coin, the daric, a small disk of pure gold, stamped with the likeness of the great king himself. For the first time, merchants from Lydia to the Indus could trade in a single currency. It gleamed like sunlight, heavy in the hand, stable in value. No longer did traders haggle over bronze and silver of uncertain worth. Under Dariush, the economy began to pulse with renewed confidence. The scent of freshly forged coin mingled with the spice of saffron and wool and olive oil in the bazaars of Persepolis and Babylon alike. But it was not enough to manage the present. Dariush had to link it. So he turned to the roads. Some had been laid down in Cyrus's time, rough and narrow. Dariush would make them imperial. The royal road, stretching nearly 2,700 kilometers from Sardis to Susa, became the spine of an empire. Couriers, changing horses at royal stations every few leagues, could carry a message across the realm in a matter of days. Soldiers could move with efficiency, tax collectors could arrive, and so could the king's justice. Along the road, inns were built, wells were dug, trees were planted, and above all, there was law. He standardized the law. Not a single code, but a network of systems. Local customs were preserved, Babylonian, Egyptian, Median, but woven into a fabric of imperial expectations. Contracts were recorded, taxes formalized, weights and measures regulated. It was a bureaucracy before the word had meaning, vast, complex, and somehow effective. Dariush was not building a kingdom. He was inventing governance. And so, from a year that had begun with rebellion, the empire emerged not shattered, but reimagined. Dariush had claimed the throne with violence, but he kept it with vision. And beneath that vision, the people began to live again. Not in peace, perhaps, but in predictability. They knew the taxman would come. They knew which measure of grain to give. They knew which roads to take, which scribes to see. And in a world that had tilted so close to chaos, that knowing was everything, still, the fires of ambition flickered in the distance. The borders were not fixed. The outer satrapies were restless. And somewhere in the far reaches of the empire, the horizon still whispered of places unconquered. Dariush had rebuilt the empire from within, but soon he would look outward, beyond the mountains, beyond the rivers, into the unclaimed world beyond. But for kings, especially those who rise from smoke and shadow, holding the throne is not enough. It must be proven, in marble, in metal, and in miles. And so, once the ink of law had dried and the fires of revolt cooled to ash, Dariush turned his gaze outward. The empire, vast though it was, still touched unknown lands. Its borders brushed against peoples who paid no tribute, who answered no summons. And in these borderlands, Dariush saw not just conquest, but confirmation. To the west lay the lands beyond the Hellespont, the rugged hills and dark forests of Thrace and Macedonia. The Greeks called it the edge of the civilized world. To the Persians, it was a threshold, one Dariush intended to cross. Around 513 BCE, he led a grand campaign across the Bosphorus, constructing an enormous bridge of boats to carry his army into Europe. The feat itself was astonishing. A floating road, tethered by engineering and will, stretching across restless waters where gulls cried and the sky opened wide. Thrace fell swiftly. Its tribes, disunited and poorly armed, could not withstand the might of Persian organization. Satraps were installed, taxes levied, envoys dispatched to Macedonia, whose kings submitted tribute without battle. This was not merely conquest, it was gesture. Dariush wanted the world, and the Greeks especially, to understand that the empire was not bounded by sea or mountain, that the great king could set foot anywhere, even in the cradle of rival civilization. From there, Dariush pushed farther still, into the unknown lands north of the Danube, seeking the elusive Scythians. They were a people of the wind, nomads, archers on horseback, moving with their herds and their gods. To fight them was like trying to cut water with a sword. They would not engage. They retreated, always just out of reach, burning their own grasslands, denying Dariush both battle and bounty. The campaign stretched thin. His men grew tired. The weather turned cold. Eventually, Dariush turned back, not defeated, but unsatisfied. He had claimed no great cities, won no famous battles. And yet the royal inscriptions would speak of the Scythian expedition as a success, a symbolic march, a declaration that there was no corner of earth the King of Kings would not touch, even if only with dusted boots and the smoke of passing fires. Still, the campaign mattered. It extended the imperial map. It brought Macedonia and Thrace into the fold, even if tenuously, and it sent a message, one that would be heard in Athens and Sparta, and echoed decades later at Marathon and Thermopylae. Persia is coming. It has seen your lands. It knows your names, and the eyes of the great king do not forget. For Dariush, the western border was now marked. For now. But to the south and east, other ambitions stirred, older lands rich with myth and gold, and far rivers that carried their own names for empire. The journey south was unlike the march into Thrace. There the wind howled through pine-dark ravines, and the land resisted with scattered cries and iron. But here, as Dariush crossed into Egypt, the air shimmered with heat. The Nile moved like a vein through the desert, slow and dignified, lined with green life and carved stone. Papyrus rustled in the breeze. Ibis birds stalked shallow waters, and everywhere the presence of the gods was thick in the air. Ra, Osiris, Anubis, carved into every wall, painted on every ceiling, buried beneath every grain of sand. Egypt had long since fallen under Persian control, conquered by Cambyses years before. But Cambyses had ruled as a stranger, distant and cruel. The Egyptians remembered him not as a king, but as a desecrator, the one who insulted the temples, who mocked the priests, who broke their sacred statues, and left a scar on the land's soul. Dariush knew this. He came not as a destroyer, but as a restorer. His arrival was measured, deliberate. Persian infantry moved in orderly silence along the riverbanks. Chariots clattered on dry earth. The air hung thick with incense and heat, the sky blinding white by day and black with stars by night. The Egyptian people, wary but weary, watched from mud-brick courtyards and shaded alleys as a new kind of conqueror approached. One who did not burn, one who listened. Dariush stood in Memphis, the ancient city of kings, and made offerings to the gods. He paid the priests in silver. He restored the temples Cambyses had defiled. He spoke to scribes in respectful tones and proclaimed himself not just great king, but pharaoh of Egypt. He had his titles carved into hieroglyphs. He wore the double crown, the red and white, symbol of unified lands, and the people, used to centuries of foreign rule and dynastic chaos, breathed, If not relief, then something near it. This was a foreign king who acted as though the gods still lived. Yet Dariush was not blind to rebellion. There were southern territories, particularly in Nubia, beyond the first cataract of the Nile, that stirred restlessly. These were lands rich in gold and cattle, ruled by their own proud chiefs and warrior clans. The march south was slow and grueling. The Nile narrowed. Crocodiles lurked beneath reeds. Rocks jutted from the river like the bones of old giants. The heat pressed down like a heavy hand. There, his troops clashed with Nubian warriors, agile, fierce, adorned with feathers and bone. The sound of battle was different here, short, sharp, echoing off cliffs and water. Spears hissed, shields cracked. The cries were not of vast armies clashing, but of intimate, brutal struggle. Persian arrows flew from high ground. Nubian javelins answered from below. But order prevailed. The campaign ended with tribute taken, rulers humbled, and Persian banners fluttering beside sun-scorched temples. What followed was reorganization. Once again, Dariush installed new governors, some Persian, some Egyptian. He ordered fresh surveys of land. Taxes were rebalanced, irrigation projects revived. He even began work on a grand canal to link the Nile to the Red Sea, a vision begun by pharaohs long before, but now reawakened in the mind of an Achaemenid king. This would connect east to west, desert to sea, and make the empire breathe through water. In Egypt, Dariush proved what he could not yet show in Greece or Scythia, that he could rule an ancient land with ancient customs, not by overwriting them, but by absorbing them. He became part of Egypt's long story, if only for a chapter, and in doing so, he carved not only new borders, but a new identity. He was no longer simply the king of Persia. He was pharaoh, builder, binder of worlds, and somewhere beyond the Red Sea, the winds of the east whispered of another frontier, one lush, river-fed, and waiting beneath monsoon skies. The winds that whispered through Egypt were dry and sun-tempered, but in the east they came heavy with moisture, carrying the scent of wet earth, jasmine, and distant rain. As Dariush turned his gaze beyond the Hindu Kush and toward the lands watered by the Indus River, he was no longer entering wild, unconquered terrain, but another cradle of civilization. Here, in the fertile valleys of Sind and Gandhara, farmers had ploughed the land for centuries. Temples rose beneath banyan trees. Languages curled like smoke, and kings spoke of time not in dynasties, but in cycles. The Persian army moved slowly, methodically, across the deserts of Arachosia, through mountain passes choked with pine and mist, across rivers swollen with meltwater. The horses sweated and slipped. The elephants, new to Persian eyes, groaned and shifted beneath their burdens. The sky here did not shimmer with dry heat. It pulsed with storms. Thunder rolled along the hills like ancient drums. The land was green, but watchful. The campaign, likely begun around 518 BCE, had little of the grandeur of Thrace or the sacred symbolism of Egypt. It was pragmatic. The eastern provinces, long a part of Cyrus's vision, had grown autonomous. Local rulers paid tribute irregularly. The edge of empire had blurred. Dariush meant to draw it sharp again. Cities like Taxila, already rich in culture and trade, were brought under firmer control. The people, Indo-Aryan in speech and Vedic in ritual, were no strangers to order, and in the Persian court, their structure found an echo. But the conquest was not merely military. It was measured in logistics and diplomacy, in the careful placement of satraps and the surveying of land. Scribes wrote names in cuneiform and Aramaic. New coinage flowed into the valleys. Roads were mapped, not yet paved, but imagined. The province that emerged, known to the Persians as Indus, became one of the richest in the empire. Its gold and grain fed the capital. Its spices perfumed the markets of Susa. Its soldiers marched beneath Persian banners in lands they had never seen. And once again the Persians did not attempt to erase the culture they found. They did not burn Vedic texts or topple altars. Instead they folded the East into the Achaemenid pattern. Satrapy, tribute, autonomy, inspection. It was a quiet conquest, a velvet annexation, and in this it differed from Greece, from Scythia, even from Egypt. It lacked spectacle but not significance. In uniting these lands beneath one banner, Dariush had done something rare. He had taken three of the world's great ancient civilizations, Mesopotamia, the Nile, and now the Indus, and brought them into one imperial breath. From this moment forward, the empire could be said to stretch from the mountains of Thrace to the rivers of Punjab, from the murmurs of the Mediterranean to the monsoon rains of the East. There were few in the known world who had not heard of the King of Kings, and fewer still who had not felt his shadow. And yet, as always, the border was not the end. Beyond every road, a new path whispered. Beyond every conquest, a new resistance stirred, and on the western edge of the empire, one such resistance was already beginning to form, in narrow city-states scattered along rocky coasts, in a language sharp as bronze, and in a people who would not easily bow. His inscriptions are clear. By the will of Ahura Mazda I am king. Again and again the name of the great wise lord, Ahura Mazda, is invoked, not only as divine protector but as moral compass. Dariush did not claim divinity for himself. He was no god-king. He was a servant, chosen to uphold the sacred order on earth. And that order, like a wheel, required every spoke to hold. He believed his right to rule came from truth, and that disorder, rebellion, deceit, cruelty, was not just treason, but blasphemy. Yet even as he promoted Zoroastrian ideals, he did not enforce them. In Babylon, the temple of Marduk was rebuilt and staffed. In Egypt, priests received offerings once again, and in Lydia, the gods of old were left unchallenged. The empire's heart may have burned with fire, but its hands held every idol with care. This tolerance was not weakness. It was wisdom. Dariush understood that loyalty was stronger when given, not forced. A devout Zoroastrian in Ecbatana could kneel beside a priest of Marduk in Babylon, and neither would fear the other. As long as taxes were paid, roads kept open, and rebellion kept at bay, the gods could speak in whatever tongue they pleased. But behind this policy of tolerance, the Zoroastrian flame burned steady, especially in court. The Magi gained influence, fire altars became more prominent, ritual purity was emphasized, and the king's language, though broad and diplomatic, began to echo with moral clarity. The world had an order. The king upheld it, and all those who defied it, traitors, rebels, liars, were not simply criminals. They were enemies of truth itself. Thus Dariush governed a world of many faiths with the soul of one who believed deeply in the power of justice and sacred balance. And it was that belief, not fanaticism, but philosophy, that helped hold together a tapestry woven from so many threads. The empire did not pray as one, but it moved as one. And in the far corners of that empire, where the king's presence was felt only as rumor or coin, a new kind of Persian order began to take root, one that did not destroy, but absorbed, refined, and endured. After the fires of rebellion were stamped out, Dariush turned not only to infrastructure, but to people. Populations displaced by war were resettled, some forcibly, others by decree, and many by opportunity. Skilled workers from Phoenicia were sent to Babylon to restore temples. Ionian artisans brought their chisels and pigments to Susa. Median horsemen were garrisoned in Egyptian outposts. The empire moved its people like threads through a loom, and from this weave came something durable and strange, a civilization that was at once deeply local and unmistakably Persian. The cities bore the change most clearly. In Persepolis, inscriptions were carved in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, because no one tongue would suffice. In the courts of governors, scribes kept records in Aramaic, the new administrative lingua franca of empire, and in the countryside, farmers who once bent beneath their own petty lords now paid tax not in fear, but in expectation, because the satrapy system, for all its flaws, offered predictability. And predictability in the ancient world was a kind of freedom. Yet this was not a perfect peace. Some resentments smouldered, some customs clashed, but the structure held. Dariush had built a realm not of sameness, but of accommodation. He understood that loyalty could be sculpted from respect, that an Ionian would bow more willingly to a king who left his gods alone, and a Babylonian would keep the grain flowing if his temples stood untouched. He ruled with distance, but not absence. And within that space, cultures flourished. And so, across the empire's length, a new kind of subject began to emerge. One who was Persian by governance, but not by blood. Loyal to the king, but anchored in their own tradition. A participant in something larger than themselves. These were not vassals, they were citizens of empire. And in the soft spaces between tribute and trust, from Nile to Indus, a quiet cohesion began to take root, the kind that neither rebellion nor time could easily uproot. There is a different kind of courage, not found on the battlefield, but in the quiet moment when a man steps into the unknown, with only the stars and the current to guide him. Around the year 510 BCE, Dariush commissioned such a man, a Greek from Caria named Scylax of Carianda, a mariner and explorer. His task was not to conquer or collect tribute, but to seek a path, a passage, a truth carried by river and tide. He was to journey down the length of the Indus River, and beyond it, into the great southern ocean. The purpose of this mission was not poetic, it was strategic. Dariush had extended his reach to the eastern frontiers of Indus. He had taken the lands of the Indus, but he did not yet know their boundaries. He sought to understand where they emptied, not only for curiosity, but for control. Trade routes, naval strategy, knowledge of the coastlines that wrapped around his empire like a question. The southern sea, what the Greeks would later call the Erythraean, was still largely a mystery, and mystery to a king like Dariush was unacceptable. Scylax set off with a small fleet, likely guided by local pilots, translators, and supply boats. They navigated the wide, muddy arms of the Indus, passing fishing villages and palm groves, sacred groves where bells rang in the wind, and cities older than myth. As they neared the delta, the water grew brackish, the air heavier with salt. And then, at last, they reached it, the endless blue curve of the sea, horizonless and vast. It was not the edge of the world. It was the beginning of another one. They turned westward, hugging the southern coastline, what is now Pakistan and Iran, and over the course of months, perhaps years, sailed all the way back to the empire's western heartlands. When Scylax returned, he carried maps, knowledge, perhaps legends, and above all, a route. Thanks to this journey, Dariush knew he could link the Nile to the Indus, not just by land, but by water. It was this knowledge that would later inspire the construction of his canal, from the Red Sea to the Nile, a grand engineering feat once imagined by pharaohs and now revived under a Persian crown. Scylax's voyage became more than a report. It was a testament, a symbol of an empire not content with what it had, but determined to understand what it ruled. And it was a reflection of Dariush himself, curious, precise, strategic, and always reaching for the edges of what was known. And so, while soldiers garrisoned the borders and scribes copied laws in distant cities, a lone ship had traced the southern hem of empire, proving that even the sea, wide and whispering, could be drawn into the orbit of the King of Kings. For all the roads that stitched the empire together, for all the scripts that recorded its order, there were still places where the name of Dariush was spoken with tight jaws and lowered voices. Nowhere more than in the west, along the jagged coastlines of Ionia, where city-states perched like birds upon the cliffs, each proud of its tongue, its gods, and its freedom. They had bowed to Persian rule after Cyrus's conquest of Lydia, but they had not forgotten what it felt like to be free. The Ionian Greeks were not one people, but many, Miletus, Ephesus, Samos and others, bound loosely by language and culture, but fiercely independent. They paid tribute. They accepted Persian-appointed tyrants. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered like oil over flame. The Persians, for all their tolerance, were foreign. Their satraps, though often effective, were outsiders. Their justice felt imposed, their taxes a weight that pressed too hard against the memory of autonomy. And so, when the spark came, the fire spread fast. The spark's name was Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus. Ambitious and calculating, he had hoped to gain Persian favor by conquering the island of Naxos, a mission that failed, humiliating both himself and the Persian commander Artaphernes. Desperate to save face, Aristagoras turned his gaze inward and lit a match. In 499 BCE, he cast off his Persian title, proclaimed freedom, and urged the Ionian cities to rise. To his surprise, they did. Temples were looted, garrisons overrun, governors slain or driven out. It was not just rebellion, it was revolution. Dariush, when he received word, did not rage. He recorded, he planned. He understood that this was not merely a military matter, it was a symbolic one. If the empire could not hold its western edge, what did it mean for the whole? And so, with measured fury, he began the work of reconquest. But the rebellion had already spread. Athens, distant, defiant, had sent ships in support of their Ionian cousins. It was a small gesture, a handful of vessels, but it was enough. Persian forces were sent to retake the cities. Sardis was burned in the chaos, its temples swallowed by smoke. The revolt pressed inland. For 6 years, from 499 to 493 BCE, the west of the empire seethed. battles were fought by land and sea. Persian armies retook cities one by one. Punishments were swift and theatrical. Miletus, the heart of the uprising, was sacked, its people enslaved, its harbour silenced. And yet, the damage had been done. The Ionian revolt had not destroyed the empire, but it had wounded its pride. Dariush had won, but in doing so, he now understood something new and dangerous. The Greeks, though small and scattered, would not bow easily. They would not be absorbed like the Medes or governed like the Babylonians. Their independence was not a matter of power. It was a matter of identity. And identity, once sharpened by defiance, becomes a weapon. So Dariush turned to his advisors. He pointed across the sea, and according to one ancient tale, he gave an order that would become legend. He took a bow and shot an arrow into the western sky. "Grant me vengeance upon the Athenians," he prayed to the heavens, and every night thereafter a servant would whisper to him before sleep, "Master, remember the Athenians." The revolt was over, the empire held, but the war was just beginning. It began with silence, a gathering of ships, the faint creak of oars, the slow rhythm of soldiers boarding under a silvered dawn. In the year 490 BCE, 7 years after the Ionian revolt was crushed, Dariush moved to strike. Not with whispers or warnings, but with war. His eyes, still fixed westward, had not forgotten the insult. The Athenians had sent ships, had fanned the flames, had dared to strike the lion's flank. Now, the lion would turn. He sent a great expedition across the Aegean, perhaps 20,000 men drawn from across the empire, Persians, Medes, Saka archers, Egyptian marines, Ionian sailors, all bound beneath one banner. The fleet moved from harbour to harbour, like a storm collecting thunder. First, the island of Naxos, burned. Then Delos spared in an act of piety, its temples preserved. But when they reached Eretria, it was razed, its people taken in chains, its gods left mute in ash. And then they crossed to the mainland, to Marathon. The Persians landed on the wide, flat plain just northeast of Athens, the sea behind them, the hills ahead. It was a place meant for cavalry, broad and open, suited to imperial warfare. The Athenians, outnumbered, stood their ground. With them were the Plataeans, their allies. No more than 10,000 in total. They dug in, prayed, waited. Then came the charge. Greek hoplites, heavy with bronze and sweat, ran across the plain. Not in retreat, not in fear, but toward the greatest empire the world had ever known. Persian arrows darkened the sky. The ground shook. Spears met wicker shields. Bronze clashed with scale. And then, something unexpected happened. The Persian line buckled. Their cavalry, never fully deployed, failed to turn the tide. Confusion spread, and soon the invincible army of the East was in retreat, not in order, but in panic. The Athenians gave chase to the very shore. Some Persian ships were seized, others escaped. But the message had already been carved into the soil. The empire could be defied. The King of Kings could bleed. It was not a great defeat in the scale of history. The empire remained vast, its armies unmatched elsewhere. But for the Greeks, and for Athens in particular, Marathon was myth made real. A victory not just of soldiers, but of civilization. East and West had met, and the West had held. In Susa, news of the loss reached the royal court. Dariush did not weep. He did not collapse. He began preparations for a second invasion, one larger, more final. But age was upon him. Rebellion stirred in Egypt. His attention was pulled. His health began to fail. He would not return to Greece, but he would leave behind a son, one raised in the fire of empire, and moulded by the queen whose blood ran from Cyrus himself. The son's name was Xerxes. The year was 486 BCE, and the empire was quiet, but not still. In the heart of Persia, beyond the golden halls of Susa and the rising stones of Persepolis, the sun hung low in the sky. The late summer winds carried with them the scent of dust, cedar, and jasmine. The birds called less often. The courtiers walked more softly. The King of Kings was dying. Dariush was no longer the young warrior who had seized power by blade and blood. He was in his mid-60s now, aged, though not ancient by the measure of kings. His hair had thinned. His once commanding voice had grown softer, more measured. Yet his eyes, even in the final weeks, were said to remain sharp. The eyes of a man who had once ruled from the Aegean to the Indus, who had carved truth into stone and measured chaos with law. Some say he died in Persepolis, the city he had dreamed into being, where columns now reached for the heavens like open hands. Others say he passed in Susa, surrounded by scrolls and scribes, whispering orders to the end. The exact place is lost to time, but the moment left a silence across the empire, like a stone dropped in still water. One by one, the satraps received word. The royal roads hummed with couriers, the temples lit sacred fires, and in the palaces, all eyes turned toward the question he left behind. There were many sons. Dariush had taken several wives, many daughters of noble blood, and had fathered children across the breadth of his reign. But one name stood above the rest. Xerxes, born of Atossa, daughter of Cyrus, the queen whose lineage bound past to present. Yet succession in Persia was never a matter of blood alone. Politics whispered, rival factions stirred. There were murmurs that Xerxes was too young, too untested, too shadowed by his mother's ambitions. Others pointed to his older half-brother, Artabazanes, born before Xerxes, though not of royal Persian lineage. Some say Dariush had already named Xerxes heir while he still lived, presenting him before the court as the chosen prince. Others suggest the decision was less certain, that Atossa, with her unmatched influence, had ensured her son's ascension through courtly maneuver, not divine right. The truth, as ever, lies beneath veils and between lines. What is known is this: when Dariush died, the question of succession did not wait. It rose like incense, sweet, choking, inescapable. His body, wrapped in linens and silence, was carried north to Naqsh-i-Rustam, the royal necropolis carved into the cliffs above the plain. There, high above the desert, his tomb waited, its entrance framed by stone guardians, its walls etched with the languages of empire. He had built it years before, perhaps knowing that even kings must one day fade. No great crowds lined the road. There were no wailing processions, only the whisper of wind, the tread of soldiers, and the slow, steady beat of time. In the end, there were no last proclamations, no dramatic confessions, only the legacy of a man who had seized a trembling empire and made it stand still. He had outlived rebellions, outpaced the horizon, and outordered chaos. And though his bones would lie in Persian earth, the echo of his rule stretched from temple to temple, road to road, language to language. Darius the Great was gone. But the empire, his empire, was not yet finished. and in the marble-shadowed halls of Persepolis, a young man now stepped forward, wearing his father's crown and the weight of all that came before him. There are moments in history where the world seems to hold its breath, not in mourning, but in calculation. Dariush was dead, and for a brief electric pause, the peacock throne stood empty. The empire itself did not falter. The roads remained guarded. The governors stayed in place. Tribute still flowed. But within the polished halls of court, in Susa, Babylon, Persepolis, a single question moved like a shadow. Who will now rule the King of Kings? The answer officially was Xerxes. He had been raised with care, a prince not only of Dariush's blood, but of Atossa's, and through Atossa, the lineage of Cyrus the Great flowed like sacred oil. To many, that alone made his claim unimpeachable. But succession in the Achaemenid world was never written in blood alone. It was written in allegiance, perception, and power. And there were others, brothers born before him, sons of other wives. Chief among them, Artabazanes, eldest son of Dariush, born during his early years, before the throne, before Atossa. Artabazanes was respected, a man of military sense, popular among some nobles. He made a case, quiet, dignified, calculated. That age should outrank bloodline. That succession should follow birth, not marriage. But Atossa, ever present behind the veil, was no less prepared. It is said she reminded the court, subtly, elegantly, that her father was Cyrus, the empire's founder, that her son bore not only the blood of kings, but of gods. In this new age, legacy mattered as much as lineage, and Xerxes had both. The nobles debated, the court murmured. But there was no uprising, no great rupture. Perhaps it was the weight of Dariush's legacy, still fresh in the minds of those assembled. Perhaps it was the strength of Atossa's alliances, or perhaps Xerxes himself, tall, composed, thoughtful, had already begun to command respect simply by standing still. In the end, the transition was sealed not with swords, but with silence. He was crowned. The empire bowed, and the question of succession, once bristling with potential fracture, dissolved like dust at dusk. But nothing in empire passes without consequence. Though the throne had passed peacefully, the court would not forget the tremor. Xerxes had inherited not just a crown, but an empire stretched to its edge, tested by revolt, haunted by defeat. And the memory of his father, brilliant, forceful, meticulous, still echoed in every column, every inscription, every breath of policy. He would rule, but the world would be watching to see if the son of Dariush could cast his own shadow. He took the throne in silence, but he did not rule quietly. Xerxes, son of Dariush, and grandson of Cyrus the Great, stepped into empire like a man entering a shadow, one not cast by enemies, but by his own blood. His father had brought order from chaos, carved roads through mountains, and ruled with the hand of justice. And his grandfather, the founder, had broken empires without breaking peoples, uniting kingdoms not by fire, but by vision. Between them, they had shaped the known world, and now it was his to bear. But the world he inherited still burned at the edges. In the west, the Greeks whispered of Marathon, of Persian defeat, of Eastern pride left in the dust. Xerxes did not forget. For years he ruled with precision, solidifying his hold, expanding his court, honoring the legacy of his line. But always, somewhere in the wind, came the echo of insult, and the drumbeat of vengeance. And in time he would answer it, not with mere whispers, but with a bridge of ships, and an army drawn from the corners of the earth. That, however, is a tale for another night. Some kings are remembered for conquest, others for cruelty, some for temples, others for poems. But Dariush, is remembered for order, not merely the kind that binds lands and roads, but the kind that tries, in its own flawed way, to make sense of a world teetering between chaos and meaning. He was buried at Nakhshe-Rustam, high above the Persian plain, his tomb cut deep into the cliff face like a doorway to eternity. Its facade shows him standing on a platform supported by the subject nations of his empire, 28 in all, their costumes still visible in the stone. Above him, Ahura Mazda hovers in winged form, blessing the one who ruled in truth. Beneath, the desert stretches wide and silent. No armies march there now, only wind and time. In the centuries that followed, his name would be spoken in awe and suspicion. The Behistun inscription chiseled into living rock became his monument, a testimony in 3 languages of his rise, his wars, his right to rule. But even that inscription, bold as it is, leaves room for doubt. Some would call him savior, others usurper, the man who crushed 19 rebellions, or the man who started with one of his own. He ruled by divine favor, so he claimed. And yet his rise came by sword, by court intrigue, by marriage. He unified a vast world, but with roads paved in blood. And yet what he built endured. The administrative machine he designed, the satrapy system, the coinage, the laws, the royal road, continued long after his death. The canal he dreamed of would one day be completed. The architecture he envisioned would inspire generations. Even the Greeks, his bitter enemies, would come to respect him. Herodotus, their great storyteller, wrote of his deeds, not always kindly, but never without wonder. More than 2,000 years have passed since his death. Empires have come and gone. Names have faded. But the idea of Dariush, the king who brought structure to empire, who ruled not only with armies but with inscription, with calendar, with scale and ledger, still lingers. In many ways, he is the model not of a conqueror, but of a ruler. One who believed that empire should not just be won, but managed, maintained, and understood. And when Alexander, the boy king of Macedon, came storming across the same deserts centuries later, when he pierced through the Persian heartland and entered Susa and Persepolis, he did not find barbarism or chaos. He found a world already shaped, already measured, already held together by something vast and deliberate. He stood in the very halls Dariush had ordered raised, marveled at the vaults, the pillars, the gold, the quiet precision of a realm conceived by intellect as much as by force. He did not destroy it all. He could not. For he too came to understand. The Hellenistic world he would forge rested on Persian stone, Persian law, Persian roads. And so, even in defeat, long after his tomb had grown silent, Dariush continued to rule, in scroll and archive, in architecture and inheritance, in the very idea that an empire could be made to last, not simply through conquest, but through care. And so, the banners are lowered, the inscriptions fade to dust, and the measured footsteps of satraps and scribes echo into silence. The empire sleeps now, not in ruin, but in rest, Its roads lie buried beneath centuries of sand. Its columns lean gently beneath moonlight. Its laws, once etched in 3 tongues, now drift like dry leaves on the wind. But still, the shape remains, not in stone, but in memory. It lingers, like the soft glow of firelight on polished bronze, like the scent of parchment in a forgotten archive, like the rhythm of a rider's hoofbeats on a path long vanished. In the hush that follows history, something of Darius the Great still breathes, not as a conqueror, but as a weaver of the world, a ruler who saw not just the battlefield, but the ledger, not just cities, but systems. He understood that greatness was not measured by noise, but by what remained once the noise was gone. And perhaps, dear listener, you feel it still, that hush, that quiet order, that sense that something vast and ancient has passed near you tonight, brushing the edge of sleep with silken robes and the scent of myrrh. If you're still with us, here by the fire, thank you, truly, for choosing stillness, for choosing presence, for carrying this story with you, if only for a while. You have walked beside kings and scribes, across golden plains and sunlit stone. You have stood beneath the gaze of Ahura Mazda, and watched as an empire tried, against the tide of time, to bring the world into harmony. These were not only chronicles of battle and coin, they were meditations on time, on trust, on the sacred art of holding things together. So now, let us part gently. Let the fire settle into glowing ash. Let the royal road disappear into the sand. The names, Dariush, Atossa, Cyrus, Xerxes, they will rest now, but they are never gone. They wait in the silence before a story is spoken, in the moment just before sleep arrives, in the hush between stars, where breath slows and the soul listens. Sleep well now. Let your night be long, your dreams gentle, and your heart carried, just a little, by the memory of a world once ruled by vision, and steadied by the hand of a king who believed the world could be made whole.